This fictional story is for entertainment only. I never thought the moment I would finally stop shrinking would happen at my sister's engagement party in front of people who had known me my entire life and still managed to look straight through me. It was June 2024, warm enough that the air outside the country club in Worthington felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my shoulders. I arrived late straight from work. My hair still pinned back the way I wore it all day, my dress simple and practical. Nothing that asked for attention. Melissa was already there, glowing, laughing, surrounded by people leaning in as if everything she said mattered. My parents hovered nearby, beaming proud in that familiar way that never quite reached me. I slipped into the room quietly like I always did, hoping to blend into the edges and make it through the night without becoming a topic. It took less than 5 minutes for that hope to disappear. Someone asked what I did for work, casually, the kind of question that usually passed right over me. Melissa answered before I could even open my mouth. She smiled wide and waved her hand in my direction like she was brushing away something small. "Lauren works for the state," she said. "You know paperwork." A few people laughed, not cruelly, almost kindly. That was the worst part. I felt the heat rise in my chest, that old familiar burn of being reduced in public while everyone pretended it was harmless. I said nothing. I smiled. I stood there holding a glass I had not touched, listening to the sound of my sister being celebrated while I faded into the background again. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was just one comment. I told myself what I had told myself for decades. Stay quiet. Keep the peace. Don't make this about you. I did not know yet that this was the moment that would break that pattern forever. Disclaimer: this story is fictional and does not depict real people or military operations. The truth was that none of what happened that night began at the country club. It started decades earlier in a quiet house in Worthington, Ohio, where the rules were never written down, but everyone seemed to know them. Melissa was the center. She always had been. From the time we were children, she filled rooms with noise and movement stories and plans, a kind of energy that adults found charming and forgiving. Teachers excused her interruptions because she was confident. Relatives laughed off her mistakes because she was spirited. When she succeeded, it was celebrated loudly. When she failed, it was reframed as bad luck, someone else's fault, a phase she would surely grow out of. I learned early that my role was different. I was the quiet one, the dependable one, the child who did not demand attention and therefore did not receive it. I brought home good grades and placed them carefully on the kitchen counter, waiting for someone to notice. Most days, no one did. My parents did not mean harm. That is what makes this kind of favoritism so difficult to explain. There were no shouted insults, no dramatic declarations. There was just a steady imbalance that never corrected itself. When Melissa spoke, my parents leaned in. When I spoke, my mother nodded absently while finishing a task, or my father glanced at the clock, already thinking about what came next. Melissa failed out of her first college program, and my parents blamed the school for not supporting her. When she quit her second job in under a year, it was because her boss did not appreciate her talent. Each time there was reassurance, financial help, encouragement to try again. When I struggled, I was expected to manage quietly. I worked longer hours, I adjusted. I did not ask for help because I could see how that conversation would go. My father, Robert Pierce, was a good man in many ways, but he avoided conflict like it was something that could physically harm him. If Melissa and I disagreed, he changed the subject. If tension rose, he left the room. He believed peace was the absence of argument, not the presence of fairness. My mother, Elaine Pierce, believed deeply in keeping the family together at all costs. Harmony mattered more to her than honesty. She explained Melissa's behavior as sensitivity, ambition, stress. She explained my silence as strength. "You are just easier," she once told me, smiling like it was a compliment. I did not know then how damaging that sentence would become. Over time, the pattern solidified. At Christmas, Melissa chose the music, the seating, the schedule. Her opinions shaped the day. If I offered a suggestion, it was politely ignored. At birthdays, hers were events complete with speeches and surprises. Mine were quiet dinners quickly wrapped up so we could get back to whatever Melissa needed. At weddings, she was asked to give toasts, to help plan, to stand front and center. I was asked to help set up chairs, collect cards, manage logistics. It was always framed as trust. "You are so reliable. You are so good at these things." I believed it for a long time. I told myself that being needed was the same as being valued, but the older I got, the clearer the distinction became. Being relied on did not mean being respected. It just meant people were comfortable overlooking you. Melissa grew used to that comfort. She spoke for me without thinking. She summarized my life in a sentence that made sense to her and never checked if it was accurate. My parents allowed it because correcting her would have caused discomfort, and discomfort was something our family avoided at all costs. There were moments I considered pushing back, moments when the imbalance was so obvious it almost demanded to be named. But each time I imagined the aftermath, the sighs, the accusations of making things awkward, the reminders to let it go, I chose silence. Silence kept the peace. Silence kept me from being labeled difficult. Silence became my survival strategy. By the time we reached our 40s, the roles were set. Melissa was the favorite, the one people made room for. I was the background, the one who made things run smoothly without being noticed. No one ever sat down and decided it would be this way. That is the lie people tell themselves about favoritism, that it requires intent. In reality, it grows quietly fed by habit and avoidance until it becomes the air everyone breathes. By the time of that engagement party, this system had been in place for so long that no one questioned it anymore. No one except me. And even then, I had learned to question it silently in private where it could not disrupt anyone else's comfort. If this sounds familiar, comment invisible. My silence did not come from shame. That is the assumption people make when they look at someone who does not speak up. They assume you are hiding because you are afraid of being seen. The truth was more complicated. I learned early that in my family, visibility came with a cost, and I was usually the one expected to pay it. When I left for Ohio State in the early 2000s to study law, it was not announced with the same pride as Melissa's decisions. There was no big send-off, no family dinner. I packed my car quietly and drove north, telling myself that I did not need applause to know I was moving in the right direction. Law school was demanding in ways that suited me. Long hours, clear rules, expectations that did not shift depending on who you were related to. I did well because the work mattered more than personality. When I called home, conversations stayed surface level. My mother asked if I was eating enough. My father asked about the weather. Melissa talked about her latest plan, her latest pivot. No one asked what kind of law I was studying. No one asked where I wanted to end up. After graduation, I built my career slowly and deliberately. I worked for the state, then moved into administrative hearings, then into more responsibility. Each step required focus and patience, and I gave it both. In 2021, when I was appointed as an administrative law judge, I sat alone in my apartment after the confirmation paperwork was finalized, letting the weight of it settle. It was not triumph that I felt, but clarity. I had earned this. I called my parents that evening. I told them I had taken on a new role. I explained that it involved presiding over hearings, making determinations, overseeing disputes. There was a pause on the line. My mother said, "That sounds busy." My father said, "Congratulations." Then Melissa started talking about something unrelated, and the moment passed. No one asked follow-up questions. No one asked what the title meant. I could have pushed. I could have said the word judge and waited for it to land. But I knew what would come next. Awkwardness, discomfort, Melissa feeling exposed, my parents scrambling to smooth it over. I had seen that pattern too many times to pretend this would be different. So I let it go. Over the years, there were other moments like that. Family dinners where someone asked vaguely what I did now. I said I worked for the state. That was true. I did not correct the assumption that followed because no one seemed interested in hearing more. It was easier to let them keep their version of me. Not smaller, just simpler, less threatening. I did not hide my work out of fear of being judged. I hid it out of consideration. I did not want to embarrass Melissa by shifting the balance she relied on. I did not want to put my parents in the position of realizing they had missed something important. Silence felt like kindness. Silence felt like restraint. Silence felt like maturity. At least that is how I justified it. Over time, that silence became habitual. I stopped correcting people reflexively. I stopped offering details that might invite comparison. I learned to redirect conversations to ask questions instead of answering them. I told myself that I was choosing peace. In reality, I was choosing invisibility because it was safer. Being the quiet one meant I was never accused of arrogance. It meant I was never blamed for making others uncomfortable. It meant the family could continue functioning without disruption. That mattered to me more than being acknowledged, or at least I thought it did. What I did not fully understand then was the cost of that choice. Silence protected everyone else from discomfort, but it also taught them that they did not need to see me clearly. It taught them that my life could be summarized by someone else without objection. Silence became my survival strategy not because I lacked a voice, but because using it always seemed to come with consequences I was expected to absorb alone. By the time of my sister's engagement party, that strategy was so ingrained that staying quiet felt automatic even when the comment cut deeper than usual. I did not realize yet that silence only works until the moment it stops working at all. The engagement party unfolded the way events like that always did in my family, loud in the right places and strangely quiet where it mattered. The country club filled quickly, the low hum of conversation mixing with the clink of glasses and polite laughter. Melissa moved through the room like it belonged to her, greeting people with practiced warmth, accepting compliments as if they were expected rather than offered. Daniel stood beside her, steady and observant, introducing her to his colleagues from work. A mix of compliance professionals, attorneys, and business owners who spoke in careful language and asked thoughtful questions. I noticed how different that felt from my own introductions. Before I had even fully set my bag down, my mother handed me a stack of place cards and nodded toward the far end of the room. She did not ask if I minded. She never did. I arranged tables, straightened chairs, adjusted centerpieces that were already perfectly aligned. Later, I was asked to keep an eye on the gift table to make sure cards were placed neatly and nothing went missing. It was familiar work, the kind that made gatherings run smoothly while keeping me just busy enough to stay out of conversations. Each task came with a quiet reminder of my role: useful, reliable, peripheral. As guests continued to arrive, the room grew warmer, louder, more alive. Conversations overlapped, laughter rose and fell, and through it all, Melissa remained at the center, recounting stories about the proposal, about their future plans, about how excited everyone should be. Every so often, her eyes flicked in my direction, and when they did, there was a look I recognized. Not cruelty, assurance. The assurance of someone who knew exactly where she stood. When someone asked about my work again, she answered before I could, her tone light, almost affectionate. "Lauren keeps the state running," she said. "Paperwork processes all that boring but important stuff." People smiled. Someone nodded sympathetically. The joke landed easily because it fit the version of me they had been given. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but I stayed quiet, hands folded, expression neutral. I told myself this was not the moment. It never was. Daniel, however, did not laugh. I noticed it the second time Melissa made the comment, then the third. He smiled politely, but his eyes lingered on me a fraction longer than they needed to. When he shook my hand, he introduced himself properly, not like someone checking a box. He asked how long I had worked for the state, not in a dismissive way, but with genuine curiosity. I answered simply, carefully, the way I always did. A long time. He nodded as if filing the information away. As the evening went on, I caught him watching me from across the room, not staring, just observing. When conversations drifted toward regulations, licensing disputes between agencies and private companies, he listened closely to who spoke and how. More than once, I felt the urge to contribute to clarify something that was being oversimplified, but I stopped myself. Old habits held firm. Melissa continued to perform, recounting her achievements with enthusiasm, glossing over the missteps that had been quietly smoothed out by my parents' support. My father laughed loudly at her jokes. My mother hovered nearby, ready to redirect any tension before it formed. The system worked exactly as it always had, except this time there was an audience that was not invested in preserving it. Daniel's colleagues spoke about cases, about hearings, about decisions that affected livelihoods and reputations. Their language was precise. Their questions were careful. I listened, recognizing the cadence of my own professional world in their conversations. When one of them mentioned a recent administrative ruling, I felt a flicker of recognition and quickly looked away. Daniel noticed. His posture shifted slightly, his attention sharpening. He asked me again later what my role involved. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough to signal that he was paying attention. I gave a vague answer and excused myself to check on the gift table. As the night wore on, the distance between what was being said about me and what was true grew heavier. I could feel it pressing against the silence I had maintained for years. The room itself seemed charged conversations, overlapping laughter slightly too loud, as if something was building beneath the surface. I did not know yet what would trigger it. I only knew that the balance I had protected for so long felt unstable, like a glass set too close to the edge of the table. Stay with me. This is where everything shifts. Dinner was announced just as the air in the room reached that brittle point where laughter sounded a little too sharp. We moved toward the long table set near the windows, the evening light slanting in and catching on glassware and polished silver. I took a seat near the end where I usually landed, close enough to be included, but far enough to be overlooked. Plates were filled, wine was poured, and conversations overlapped in small clusters. Melissa launched into another story about their plans, her voice bright and confident, my parents nodding along. Daniel sat across from me, listening more than he spoke, his attention moving between faces instead of staying fixed on the center of the table. When a pause opened, he turned slightly in his chair and looked at me. Really looked at me as if he had finally decided to ask the question that had been hovering all night. "So what do you actually do for the state?" he said. The words were calm, almost casual, but they landed with a weight that surprised everyone, including me. The table went quiet in a way that was immediate and unmistakable. Forks paused mid-air. Someone cleared their throat and then stopped. My mother's eyes flicked toward Melissa, then back to her plate. My father reached for his glass and set it down again without taking a sip. The silence was not polite. It was expectant. Melissa laughed quickly, the sound a little too high, and leaned forward as if to answer for me. She waved her hand, already shaping the familiar explanation, already smoothing the edges. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the reflex to let it happen, to let the moment pass the way it always did. I could hear my own thoughts racing, measuring the cost of speaking versus staying quiet. If I answered plainly, the balance would shift. If I stayed silent, the lie would continue breathing on its own. For years, silence had felt like the responsible choice. It kept the peace. It spared feelings. It avoided scenes. But sitting there with Daniel waiting and the table suspended around us, I felt something new underneath the hesitation. Not anger, not fear. A steady pressure, like a door that had finally been pushed too far. I glanced at my parents. They looked unsettled, not angry, just uncertain, as if they were realizing for the first time that there might be more to the story they had accepted so easily. I glanced at Melissa. Her smile was fixed now, her eyes sharp, daring me to fall back into place. The room seemed to narrow, every sound fading until all I could hear was my own breathing. I thought about how many times this question had been asked indirectly and then abandoned. How many times I had allowed myself to be summarized in a way that made everyone else comfortable. How often I had mistaken restraint for kindness. Daniel did not rush me. He did not repeat the question or try to fill the silence. He simply waited, his expression open, attentive, without judgment. That was what made it impossible to retreat. For the first time, the question was not being used to categorize me or move the conversation along. It was an invitation to be accurate. I felt the weight of years pressing into that moment, the holidays and dinners and small dismissals stacking up behind it. My hands rested on the table, fingers curled lightly around the edge, grounding myself in the physical reality of where I was. The wood was cool, solid, real. The silence stretched no longer awkward, but charged, like everyone sensed that whatever came next would matter. I had spent so long protecting everyone else from discomfort that I had forgotten what it felt like to protect myself. I could still choose silence. I could still let Melissa speak for me and keep the familiar order intact. The thought passed through me clearly, and then it moved on. I realized then that this was not about proving anything or reclaiming attention. It was about refusing to continue a story that was no longer true. I drew a slow breath, aware that once I spoke, there would be no pretending this moment had never happened. Across from me, Daniel waited. To my side, my family held still. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to consider what would happen if I answered the question honestly. I did not raise my voice. I did not smile. I did not add context or soften what I was about to say. I simply answered this question that had been hanging in the air. I am an administrative law judge. The words were quiet, almost ordinary, but they landed with a force I could feel ripple across the table. For a split second, nothing happened. No gasps, no interruptions. Just a strange stillness, as if the room itself needed time to process what had been said. Then I saw it register on Daniel's face. The color drained from it slowly, not in shock, but in recognition. His posture changed. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, studying me with a focus that had nothing to do with politeness anymore. "Judge Pierce," he said, his voice lower now, careful. "You presided over my client's hearing last fall, the licensing dispute downtown. I remember you." The silence deepened. It was no longer awkward. It was absolute. Someone at the far end of the table stopped mid-motion, a glass hovering inches above the tablecloth. My mother's hand froze around her fork. My father stared straight ahead, his expression blank as if his mind had stalled. Daniel continued, not loudly, not dramatically, just stating facts as they occurred to him. "You were direct. You asked the right questions. You shut down arguments that did not matter. You ruled fairly." That is why I remember. I felt every eye shift toward me, not with curiosity now, but with recalibration. The version of me they had been carrying no longer fit. Before anyone could speak, a woman seated 2 chairs down cleared her throat. She was an attorney, someone Daniel had introduced earlier, and she was looking at me with the same dawning recognition. She nodded once slowly. "I have been in your courtroom too," she said. 2 years ago. Administrative appeal. You were calm, thorough. I thought I recognized you earlier, but I could not place it until now." The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had moved in without anyone noticing. Melissa laughed sharp and sudden, the sound cutting through the silence like glass. "This is a joke," she said, waving her hand again, trying to pull the moment back into something she could control. "Lauren, stop. This is not funny." Her eyes darted to my parents, then back to me, searching for agreement, for rescue. No one moved. No one laughed with her. I stayed still, my hands resting on the table, my expression unchanged. I did not repeat myself. I did not defend the statement or decorate it with explanation. The truth did not need reinforcement. It was already doing its work. My mother's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again as if the sentence she wanted had never been rehearsed. My father swallowed hard and finally looked at me. Really looked at me, not as the quiet daughter who handled logistics, but as someone he did not fully know. His eyes flickered with confusion, then something closer to realization. Melissa pushed her chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor, a sound that felt too loud in the heavy quiet. "Why would you let us believe you were just doing paperwork?" she demanded, her voice tight, almost pleading now. I did not answer. Daniel turned toward her, his expression no longer indulgent. She did not let anyone believe anything he said evenly. "You told that story. You never asked her to correct it." That sentence landed harder than anything I could have said. It reframed the entire moment, shifting responsibility back where it belonged. Around the table, reactions spread in small, contained ways. Someone avoided Melissa's gaze. Someone else leaned back, arms crossed, reassessing. The hierarchy that had been taken for granted only minutes earlier had quietly collapsed. No announcement, no confrontation, just a collective understanding that something fundamental had been wrong and that wrongness was now visible. Melissa stood up abruptly. "This is my engagement party," she said, her voice rising brittle at the edges. "You are not going to hijack it with this." I looked at her then, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm I had not felt in years. I did not hijack anything I said. I answered a question. She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, really seeing me and not liking what she found. My parents said nothing. They could not. Any attempt to smooth this over would have required pretending it had not happened, and that was no longer possible. The truth had entered the room and settled in heavy and undeniable. I felt it in my chest, not as triumph, but as release. The effort it had taken to stay small, to manage perceptions, to protect a system that never protected me, drained away all at once. Around us, the party had stalled. Conversations had stopped. The attention that had always orbited Melissa had shifted not toward me exactly, but away from her. That was the real reversal. Not applause, not admiration, just the quiet withdrawal of unquestioned authority. Daniel looked at me again this time with something like respect. He nodded once, a small gesture, but a decisive one. In that moment, I understood that nothing else needed to be said. The truth had come out in front of everyone, not because I demanded it, but because I finally stopped preventing it. Do not blink. This is the moment. The shift did not happen all at once. It moved through the room in small, undeniable ways, like a tide that does not announce itself but leaves everything rearranged. Melissa tried to regain control first. Her voice grew louder, her laughter sharper, as if volume alone could pull attention back into place. She made a joke about timing, about how people loved drama, about how families always exaggerated things. It did not land. A few minutes earlier, those same jokes would have drawn easy smiles. Now they hung in the air and fell flat. She glanced around, searching for backup, for the familiar reflex of someone stepping in to defend her, to smooth the edges. It did not come. My parents sat very still. My mother kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if it might offer guidance. My father stared at the centerpiece, his jaw set, not angry, not disappointed, just unsettled. I could see the realization working its way through them slowly and painfully. They had not been deceived. They had simply never asked. The difference mattered. It meant there was no one to blame except the comfort they had chosen for years. Melissa noticed it too. She turned to them, her voice sharpening with urgency, asking why they were letting this happen, why no one was saying anything. My mother finally looked up, her expression uncertain, as if she were seeing the scene from a distance. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing she could say that would not confirm what everyone already understood. That silence spoke louder than any defense. Around the table, conversations began again, but differently. People leaned toward each other, voices, lowered eyes flicking between Melissa and me. Not gossip exactly, more like recalibration. The story they had been given had changed, and they were adjusting their footing. No one laughed when Melissa scoffed. No one nodded along when she tried to dismiss the moment as a misunderstanding. Even Daniel stayed quiet, now his presence no longer aligned with hers. That absence mattered. I stayed where I was. I did not stand up. I did not leave. I did not offer explanations or apologies for the discomfort. I let the moment exist without interference. That was new for me. For years, my instinct had been to repair whatever tension appeared to absorb it, to make things easier for everyone else. This time, I resisted the urge. I took a sip of water. I listened. I breathed. The party did not end, but it changed shape. The attention that had always circled Melissa loosened its grip. People spoke to her less, not out of cruelty, but caution. They did not know where she stood anymore. That uncertainty was unfamiliar to her, and it showed. Her movements grew sharper. Her words came faster. She was used to being the axis. Without it, she wobbled. My parents watched this unfold with a kind of quiet shock. I could almost see the questions forming behind their eyes. When had this happened? How had they missed it? What else had they overlooked because it was easier not to look too closely? They did not ask me those questions. Not yet. Perhaps they sensed that this was not the moment to demand answers. Or perhaps they were afraid of what the answers would require them to admit. Either way, the absence of immediate confrontation felt significant. It was the first time they had not rushed to restore the old balance. A few people approached me quietly, not to congratulate me, not to pry. Just small acknowledgments, a nod, a brief comment about a case they remembered, a simple respectful introduction that treated me as exactly what I was without embellishment. Each one felt like a subtle correction to years of being misnamed. I accepted them calmly without leaning into the attention or shrinking away from it. I did not look at Melissa when she stormed toward the bar, or when she snapped at the staff, or when she returned to the table and found no one eager to engage. I did not need to. The contrast was clear enough. When the evening wound down, people began to leave in clusters. Goodbyes were shorter. The energy had drained out of the celebration, replaced by something quieter and more honest. I stood when it was time, thanked the hosts, and offered my parents a brief hug. It was awkward, careful, but real. I did not apologize. I did not explain. I simply existed in the space I had always occupied, now finally visible. As I walked out into the warm night air, I felt no rush of victory. What I felt instead was steadiness. The social order that had once diminished me had corrected itself without my intervention. That was the consequence. Not punishment, not revenge, just a recalibration that left no room for denial. The night did not end with a confrontation or a dramatic exit. It ended quietly, the way most truths do once they have finished doing their work. I drove home alone through familiar streets, the hum of the road steady beneath me, my mind unusually calm. There was no replaying of conversations, no imagined arguments, no surge of adrenaline, just a sense of space where tension used to live. When I got home, I placed my keys on the counter and stood there for a moment listening to the quiet of my apartment. It felt lighter than it had in years, not because anything had been fixed, but because something false had finally been removed. I slept deeply that night without the tightness in my chest that usually followed family gatherings. The next morning, the messages began. They arrived cautiously at first, then in clusters. A text from my mother that said she was sorry if I had ever felt overlooked. A missed call from my father that went to voicemail, his message careful and unsure, asking if we could talk when I had time. A longer message from an aunt who said she had always sensed something was off and hoped I knew how much she respected me. Even Melissa sent a message, short and clipped, saying that the night had been stressful and that things had gotten out of hand. None of them asked directly about my work. None of them apologized clearly. I read each message once and set my phone down. I did not respond. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I needed time to understand what I was feeling before I spoke. For years, I had rushed to reassure, to smooth, to make sure everyone else felt comfortable before checking in with myself. This time, I chose differently. I went about my weekend slowly. I made coffee and sat by the window watching the city wake up. I took a long walk through my neighborhood, noticing small details I usually rushed past. I thought about the party not with regret or triumph, but with curiosity. What surprised me most was the absence of a victory feeling. There was no sense of having won anything, no satisfaction in seeing Melissa unsettled or my parents quiet. Instead, there was a gentle release, like setting down a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten it was there. The truth had not elevated me. It had simply put me back where I belonged. That distinction mattered. Over the next few days, more messages arrived. Some were awkward attempts at reconnection. Some were carefully worded apologies that circled the issue without naming it. A few were invitations to talk things through. I let them sit. I did not owe anyone an immediate response. For once, I allowed silence to serve me instead of everyone else. When I finally did respond, it was brief and neutral. "Thank you for reaching out. I need some time." That was all. No explanations. No assurances, just a boundary stated calmly. The reactions to that boundary told me more than any conversation could have. Some people respected it immediately. Others pushed, asking when would be a better time. What did I mean by needing space? I did not answer those questions either. The need to clarify, to justify, to manage expectations had loosened its grip on me. I noticed changes in myself that week. At work, I felt more grounded, less inclined to over-prepare or second-guess. In conversations with colleagues, I spoke plainly without minimizing my role. In quiet moments, I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating discomfort that never truly belonged to me. Letting that go created room for something steadier. I did not feel disconnected from my family. I felt appropriately distant. There is a difference. Distance can be an act of care when closeness has been built on imbalance. The quiet after the storm gave me space to recognize that I had not ruined anything. I had not exposed secrets out of spite. I had answered a question honestly, and the consequences had unfolded on their own. That realization brought a kind of peace I had not expected. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply settled in and stayed. If you have ever waited years to be seen, tap like. 3 months passed before Melissa reached out again, and when she did, it was not with reflection or accountability. It was with need. The message came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing paperwork at my desk, the kind of quiet hour when the building settled and thoughts had room to form. Her name on my screen still created a small pause in my body, a reflex I noticed and let pass. She asked if we could talk. She said it was important. She did not mention the engagement party. She did not mention the silence that followed. She framed it as practical urgent, something that required my input. I agreed to a brief call, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. When the line connected, her voice sounded familiar in the way habits do. Controlled, slightly strained, moving quickly toward the point. She explained that her business was facing an issue with permits and licensing, something about a compliance review that had stalled her operations. She said the process was confusing, that deadlines were tight, that she just needed some guidance. She spoke as if we had picked up where we left off, as if nothing fundamental had shifted. I listened without interrupting, noticing how she described the problem. The agency was being unreasonable. The requirements were excessive. The timeline was unfair. It sounded like every explanation I had heard her give when things did not go her way. Then she said my name in that familiar tone, the one that assumed availability. She asked if I could take a look, if I could help her understand how to navigate it, if I could make a call or point her in the right direction. She did not ask if this was appropriate. She did not ask how I felt. She simply reached for the same advantage she had always relied on. I felt no surge of anger, no temptation to lecture. What I felt was distance, clear and settled. I told her I could not help her with that. There was a pause, sharp and immediate. She asked, why, her voice tightening as if the answer were obvious and the refusal was the problem. I said it calmly, without explanation beyond what was necessary. I do not blur boundaries anymore. The words landed heavily. She laughed once, incredulous, and said I was overreacting, that this was just family helping family, that I was reading too much into things. I did not engage with the framing. I repeated that I could not assist her and that she would need to work through the proper channels. The tone of the call changed. Her voice rose. She accused me of holding a grudge, of enjoying the power shift, of forgetting where I came from. I let her speak. When she finished, I said I hoped she found the support she needed and ended the call. Afterward, I sat for a moment, hands resting on the desk, noticing the absence of guilt. That was new. In the past, I would have replayed the conversation, wondering if I had been too harsh, too distant, too firm. This time, there was no second guessing. The boundary felt appropriate, not punitive. Over the next few weeks, I heard updates indirectly. Melissa struggled with the process. She missed a deadline. She had to hire outside counsel, someone who charged by the hour and did not soften instructions. My parents tried to step in, making calls, offering help, but there was nothing they could smooth over this time. The rules applied evenly without regard for family dynamics. The frustration that followed was not aimed inward. It spilled outward toward the system, toward perceived unfairness. But without access to me, without the quiet corrections and unseen assistance I had provided in the past, she had to confront the process on its own terms. That was the consequence, not punishment, not retaliation, just the absence of special treatment. My parents called me once during that period. My mother asked if there was anything I could do, her voice cautious, as if she already knew the answer. I told her gently that I could not. There was a pause, then a small sigh. She said she understood. I believed her, at least in that moment. What struck me most was how ordinary life felt afterward. No explosion, no final confrontation, just a series of adjustments as everyone learned to move without the old shortcuts. Melissa stopped calling. The requests ceased. The family system recalibrated again, this time without me absorbing the strain. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. For the first time, my position was clear, not just to others, but to myself. I was no longer the silent buffer or the invisible support. I was simply a person with boundaries, and that was enough. Healing did not arrive as a dramatic reconciliation or a long overdue apology delivered perfectly at the right moment. It arrived slowly, unevenly, in ways that required patience rather than hope. My parents changed, but not all at once. There were no sudden realizations or emotional speeches about what they had missed. Instead, there were small shifts that only became noticeable over time. My mother began asking questions and waiting for the answers, not filling the silence, not redirecting the conversation when it grew uncomfortable, just listening even when she did not know what to say next. My father stopped assuming and started checking in cautiously at first, as if he were learning a new language late in life. Neither of them asked me to make things the way they used to be. That mattered more than apologies ever could. I kept my distance not out of bitterness but out of respect for the reality of what had happened. Closeness built on imbalance does not become healthy overnight. We met occasionally for coffee or short dinner settings that allowed for conversation without pressure. I left when I needed to. I did not explain why. I no longer felt obligated to manage their reactions or protect them from the consequences of their own discomfort. Melissa remained largely absent from my life. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic fallout, just space. I accepted that as progress rather than failure. Not every relationship needs to be repaired to prove growth. Some simply need to be redefined. What surprised me most was how ordinary my days felt once I stopped carrying the weight of being invisible. Work remained demanding, but it felt grounded. I slept better. I spoke more plainly. I noticed how often I had once rehearsed conversations in my head before they even happened, bracing for dismissal that never came anymore. The peace I found was not loud or triumphant. It was practical. It showed up in routines, in choices, in the quiet confidence of knowing where I stood. I did not feel the need to prove anything to anyone. I did not need to be seen by everyone to feel whole. Being accurate about who I was turned out to be enough. The family system did not collapse. It adjusted. Slowly. Imperfectly. Honestly. And for the first time, I was not contorting myself to keep it intact. That was the healing. Not forgiveness without accountability. Not closeness without change. Just a steady sense of alignment between who I was and how I lived. You do not owe anyone a smaller version of yourself. Share your story below and subscribe if this resonated.